Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar featuring myself, Steve, and Dan. Thank you for your time and attention joining us today for today's webinar entitled The State of CI/CD 2024. Before we begin, before I allow Steve and Dan to unmute themselves and give their own introductions, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. This is a live webinar, which means you can ask your own questions. If you have a question, feel free to use the chat window presented in this UI. Let us know and we'll answer them live. We have a lot of folks joining us from various parts around the world. We've got Steve from obviously the UK. We've got Matthew from Florida. We've got Michael from Germany, Guten Tag. We've got Joanna from North Dakota. There you go. So feel free to take advantage of the chat window, ask your questions, and we will answer them live here in this webinar. The other thing I just want to briefly mention is that you are in the right place. This is a webinar that we conduct. You can find out more information at our website, which is octopus.com/webinars. Make this your homepage, if not a bookmark. This is the webinar we are currently conducting, the State of CI/CD 2024. Coming up next, later on, we're going to have Paul and we're going to have Nathan from Google talking to us about navigating success with Dora. And then we've got Bob talking about Kubernetes. And then later on in June, we have a really exciting webinar entitled Introducing the Octopus Deploy app for GitHub. There we'll be showcasing a new feature that we've introduced for integration with GitHub. So check it out, octopus.com/webinars. Believe me, there's more. This is not the exhaustive list, but we will be adding more and more webinars as we go through. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve to take a second or two to introduce himself. Steve, let the folks know who you are.
Hey everyone, my name's Steve Fenton and I work at Octopus Deploy. I'm also a member of the CD Foundation's Outreach Committee, and I was on the CDCon overview committee this year. And I'm a big fan of research because it's taking us into a new era of software delivery, where instead of just having to listen to people who wrote books, whose advice was very good, we can now actually get some more insights and actually drive it with a bit more data.
Fantastic. And Dan?
Yeah, my name is Dan Garfield, and I'm an Argo maintainer. I run open source programs at Octopus, and previously co-founder of CodeFresh, recently acquired and joining this Octopus team.
Fantastic. That actually provides a nice segue. So tell us a little bit about CodeFresh.
Yeah, for those that aren't familiar with CodeFresh, we are primarily a CI/CD and continuous delivery platform built entirely for Kubernetes, basically from the get-go. And so that's why we're maintainers of the Argo project. And so yeah, we have both CI/CD pipelines. We've got enterprise Argo, and that's been our focus. And that's kind of the big reason why Octopus had us join the team.
Fantastic. And I'll put you on the spot here, Steve. Why don't you tell us what you think we do at Octopus? I say this almost every week, but I'd love to hear your sort of highlight what you think what we do at Octopus.
Yep. So before I came to Octopus, I was a heavy Octopus user, and I was using it to do all of my deployments to all the different places that I was deploying. So I had virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, Azure functions, all kinds of different places. So Octopus was my one-stop shop for all of that. And I was also using runbooks, which allowed me to automate ops tasks as well. So no longer did I have to have tickets raised for tasks that needed to be run on different deployment targets. I could give people a little button to press. So nice. That was a feature that made me very happy.
Steve, we got a question here from Matthew. Where do you get your shirt?
We'll drop a link for this. We created it ourselves just as a bit of fun, but we have put it up on a site which with the money going to Girls Who Code. So yeah, we'll drop a link for that after
Fantastic.
The call.
Awesome. So we are here to discuss the State of CI/CD report, which was recently published by the CD Foundation. You can find out more by visiting cd.foundation. And yes, .foundation is a TLD. So there you go. That was new to me a couple of years ago when I found that out. But as we know, there's lots of TLDs. The CD Foundation, we're a member of this, and they publish a lot of reports. This is the new State of CI/CD report, which we'll be talking about in this webinar, which is featured here. If you want to check it out, you can go take a look. Steve has also written a blog post that highlights the summary of what is in that report. For those who haven't seen it, this is what the report looks like. It's PDF. We're going to go through it a little bit here in the context of this webinar, provide our own insights here. But Steve, at a high level, based on your blog post here, what were some of the things that you found interesting in this year's update or report?
Yeah, so the report's super interesting. It's got 150,000 responses. It's commissioned by the CD Foundation and performed by Slashdata.
Yep.
And basically it tracks things like what tools are people using. So not just CI/CD tools, but other tools as part of the software delivery process. So it tracks the adoption, it tracks the trends over time, and it tracks the link between those tools and how well the teams perform. And one of the things I had a deep dive into this year was the adoption based on experience. And it's probably not very surprising. The newer developers haven't adopted as many tools. But as you go through your career and you kind of learn more skills, you tend to adopt more tools. And version control and work item management are really popular tools, funnily enough. It's best not to develop without version control.
Yeah, I would say so.
And CI/CD tools are the ones that have the biggest uplift. So with experience, they're the ones that people really go for.
So this chart here is just basically showcasing that idea, which is if you've got less experience, you're using less tools. And as you know, some of us who have gray beards, like yourself and myself, we collect more lint, so to speak, in the tool lint tray. We use more tools, but that's a good thing. Obviously, we want to use more tools, and there's reason for that, which I'm sure you'll probably go into. But if you're all curious, as I said before, they've interviewed over 150,000 technical folks, practitioners, and found that more tools is actually seems to be commonplace amongst more experienced practitioners.
Is there
anything else in?
Is there like a tool drop off there? Do you think? Like, I'm sure that somebody who's been around for 16 years has like experience with Perforce, you know, but like nobody in the last 5 years does, and like that's probably fine.
Yeah, there's so mostly the tools that are being tracked in the report, almost all of them get more adoption over time because they're tracking by category more than anything else. So it's like if you imagine you end up broadening across the whole development process. So you might start off like more of a programmer and you're really mostly interested in your IDE and your version control. And then you get more interested in a broader set of things. You're like, well, now I'm interested in how we define these things we're working on and how we build and deploy them and then monitoring and so on. So it's more across categories you tend to accumulate. The two outliers in this report were GitOps and cloud-based IDEs. So they were the ones that had a different pattern because they tended to have a larger adoption in the middle. So the people with that middle experience, and that's probably because they're a lot newer. So, you know, like if you've got 16 plus years of experience, like, well, GitOps came along only a few years ago. So it might not have been added to your drawer full of tools yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, GitOps is so new. Though the year that like GitOps was like defined as like a set of standards, like the GitOps principles came out, that was like 2017. No, it was like 2018, 2019. And at the time, I think if you ask people, they're like, GitOps, yeah, I do that. Because they heard like Git and Ops, and they're like, I use Git, I do Ops. Job's done.
Yep.
Not without necessarily like, you know, getting into the in depth of it. But it makes sense that people would be like kind of mid-range in their careers that would be maybe a little bit more apt to adopt maybe a little bit more quickly. So that follows.
Yeah, I imagine that they probably joined development at the time things like GitOps were coming out. So they were probably a lot more open to adopting that style of workflow more than someone who had a decade of experience at that point. And they're like, I've already got my way of working now. So GitOps is like a big jump for me.
There's a great question here by Joanna who's asking, oops, sorry, I highlighted the wrong one. Sorry, the questions are coming in fast and furious. Joanna was asking in the chat what CI/CD tools are you using. So we'll keep that question up there. But in the meantime, so Steve, you were noting here that the tools that had the biggest uptake with experience are source control over years. So what this is basically saying that as you become more grizzled, as you become a little bit more gray in the beard, source control is definitely the one that takes the largest share of the pie, so to speak. Issue tracking, then generalized CI/CD. I think this would probably follow for your experience, wouldn't it?
For me, yeah, definitely. Obviously, quite a lot of people who are early on in their development career are kind of doing lone wolf projects. So the collaboration tools aren't as important, which is why you still find some startups who don't have their code in version control because the founder has written it and like it's just available. They can change it whenever they want, and they haven't really thought about the collaboration or what happens if their machine blows up. But if you've got 10 years experience and you haven't used version control throughout that 10 years, you'll have awful war stories, right? So almost everyone adopts version control with experience.
I would love to hear the story of somebody who's been doing DevOps or engineering for 10 years and hasn't used version control. Like, what would they even be doing? I'm honestly like baffled by the idea. Like, what do you do at the end of the day? Like, where does your code go? Who builds it? What are you doing?
Steve, I do have a couple of examples if you'd like to hear them, but we might need some kind of trauma warning. There was one company where they couldn't start working on their code until the founder plugged in their USB stick in the morning because all the code was on their laptop, and effectively it was like a network drive for every other developer. And their backup plan was that they would take the laptop home with them. That was their strategy for backups. So, yeah.
Wow. I mean, the fact that no one spoke up and was like, hey, this is kind of crazy. So I guess they were developing off of a network drive. So they're like, oh, we all just develop off a network drive. Like, how would you even run a build? You're like, oh, sorry, Joe's not done with his function that he's been writing, so stuff won't build yet. Like,
yeah,
wow, that's bonkers.
Yeah, that was their main driver for changing it, was that builds would have problems with files being locked. So that's what convinced them in the end to actually adopt some slightly better tools.
That's terrible.
So as much as I would like to share war stories about old source control systems like Visual Source Safe, for example, maybe we should probably get back to the report. And we haven't actually talked to the report directly. But so for Steve's blog post, which highlights some of the things we've talked about, you can check out his blog post, which is, again, at the CD Foundation. It's linked to that from the report itself. But the report itself actually does provide a general overview, and then the most interesting part of the report is the key insights. So we can go in through some of these. So some of the key insights here include DevOps adoption remains high, with 83% of developers involved in DevOps-related activities as of Q1 2024. That number has remained consistently high. That is, adoption of automation, DevOps practices, etc., continues to be strong. So that's a good thing. Developers with less experience in software development have a lower adoption. That's pretty understandable, right? Less experience, less knowledge of tools, less use, etc. Continuous integration and continuous delivery are the 4th and 5th most popular DevOps-related activities. So I want to drill into this one because I think there's some interesting insights here. So the vast majority of developers, as we said before, are involved in DevOps practices. Now, those practices can vary. So they differ, and that based on the question here, which of the following development activities are you involved in? The thing that surprised me is that, continuous integration is relatively low. It's a lot lower than I would have expected. So here's the difference here. You can see Q3 versus Q1 2024. So the green bars are Q3 2023. The blue bars are Q1 2024. We saw a bit of a drop. I think that's a bit of an anomaly, isn't it, Steve?
Yeah, so, I mean, what's interesting about this is there is a slight drop in a lot of these tools and practices. And also we're seeing a slight drop in performance as well, which kind of confirms what we know, right? Is that these tools help people perform when it comes to software delivery. So the most likely cause of this is the data that we collected. There were probably more inexperienced developers in the set in this quarter, because that then matches this pattern of adopting more tools as you get more experience.
And this one, I build CI/CD pipelines. I guess they're probably thinking I'm cutting YAML or something to that effect. Like I'm actually building the workflows that are involved in those pipelines, not I'm using them. Okay.
Yeah, well, there's the one above it that's like number 4. I use continuous integration to automatically build and test my code changes. So that one's, like a third of people, which honestly is kind of low for what I expected. But I also was thinking as I was reading this, if we're seeing a little bit of a shift in the way that people think about CI/CD, because if you go back even a couple years ago and you said, oh, well, I use CI/CD pipelines, they're doing continuous integration pipelines and continuous delivery pipelines, and they'd use the same tool for that. And as we've seen the rise of tools like Octopus, where it's like, oh, actually there are dedicated CD tools that can do this stuff better than like a lot of scripts that you can write, and they're going to work a little bit differently. I've always seen a lot of people describe CI/CD pipelines when really they just mean CI pipelines. So I wonder if there might be some understanding change that's happening there. Though it's kind of hard to tell. I mean, with the audience changing in this graphic, I don't think there's necessarily any like direct evidence to point to that, but it's something I would expect to be happening.
I do like this one.
I also think people are more aware now that if they're having long-lived branches, that probably shouldn't be called continuous integration. So if you have a branch for 2 weeks that's not very continuous, that's actually delayed integration. And I think people are more aware of that tighter definition of what we mean by continuous integration.
I'll merge my branch when I'm good and ready. Thank you very much, Steve. This one I do like. I'm a big advocate of observability and monitoring, and I would liken this to what people would classically call the sort of system administrators. But I think that if you're a developer, this is just as important as anything, right? Like I think of things like feature flags and monitoring in production. This number I would like to see go higher. This is a great way of deploying software, especially for the cloud when you can actually monitor things and seeing how things turn out in the wild. So, there's lots and lots of good insight here, but these numbers are low. I wish they were higher. Steve, was there any insight on this that was shared in the report reflecting these numbers?
So one thing to bear in mind, when an individual is responding to these questions, the respondents do come from the full set of what Agile would call developers. So some of the folks in these teams will be maybe like testers or product owners or other specialists. And so they would say, like, for example, if you had someone more ops focused, they might be saying, yep, I definitely monitor the software. I definitely automate my infrastructure, but I don't do these other things because I don't cut the code myself. I'm not doing that part of the job. So that can bring the numbers down a bit. But also we know that, like, although we're often in contact with companies because we're in CI/CD space that are doing these things, there's loads of organizations out there that still aren't doing any of this. So it's a combination.
Steve, what are your Dan, what are your sort of insights on this or gut feel on some of these numbers? Do you think they're low as well?
Yeah, the question. I mean, the question is, which of the following development activities are you involved in? And it's a percentage of developers. So I wouldn't be shocked, if I'm just a developer working on code, making changes and stuff. I'm not going to be necessarily monitoring for performance. That's kind of like asking if you're an SRE, that top question, right? So there are a lot of SREs in this. Yeah. Maybe I'm not approving the code, but I use continuous integration to automatically build and test. That one's pretty shocking. I'm that one I would expect to be the highest. Anybody that's writing code, I would be expecting we have some automated builds. Unless you're a team of one, and even if you were a team of one, it's still probably more efficient. But from a security standpoint, if you don't have automated build processes, you're just building locally on your machine and pushing it. I've actually seen an organization that had they didn't have automated builds, and they had a developer click on an email that allowed attackers to gain access to their machine. This is, back in the day when emails were more likely to do that. And they like started deploying spam to all of this developer, all the website, all the sites that this developer had access to. That's the kind of stuff that happens when you don't have like build systems in place. You have one developer or one person go rogue. We certainly saw that in the open source world recently, where an attacker basically gained deploy access to an open source project and pushed malicious builds that weren't part of the automated build system, because they would have had to have injected their code at that point. So I don't know, just as a best practice, even just because it's more convenient to have builds automated, and like, how are you doing testing if you're not automating that? That one shocks me. It hurts a little bit that it's so low.
Yeah. The exploit that you're referring to is the exploit that went into the XZ utils. There was also the issue that went in with, there's a few instances of this, but basically this library was behaving weirdly, and a researcher at Microsoft picked it up and found that some source code had actually fallen into, source code had been committed to the tree itself and found its way into the utils library. So that's
the maintainer spent 18 months contributing to this project in order to gain trusted access to do this stuff, and the Microsoft researcher just noticed that it was running slower than it should.
Yes,
they're like, what happened? There's a performance problem.
Just as a reminder to folks, this is a live webinar, so if you have any questions or any feedback, for example, we're happy to take them. So one insight, for example, here is from David. I know a few folks who create spreadsheets to track component coupling and use it for, quote, release management. Thankful. I don't see that one in this graph, so there you go. Great. I'm sure we could spend a whole hour just talking about war stories, so there you go. There's another comment here. I think involved is too much of a broad term for devs.
Yeah,
that's a good insight. Yeah, fair enough. So jumping back to the key insights page here, on page 7 here. So we talked a little bit about how they're 4th and 5th in the DevOps related activities. Source control management and issue tracking hold the top spots for most widely used DevOps technologies. So here's another chart that reflects that. So usage rate of AI assisted coding and agile project management tools have remained consistent over the last year. That's pretty hopeful for AI consistent coding. So if you're using things like Copilot, that's something that you can use there. But source control management, easily top of the list. Issue tracking, easily top of the list. Those 1 and 2, those make total sense to me. Agile project management tools, I guess it's still hanging on. Look at test automation. There's a bit of a big drop here. So, Steve, any insights you wanted to share?
Yeah, again, I think it's one of those things. So I often get frustrated when I'm working on a team and they're not writing any tests. And then I kind of go back and check my CV and work out how long it took me to actually master that skill. And it took me a bit of time. Like, it wasn't 6 months and I was a great tester as part of my development role. So I think when you've got lots of people who have got less than 1 year experience or even less than 5 years experience, it's going to be something that, unless their company is so into testing that it's part of the onboarding and they really focus on it, it's so easily missed, and it takes time to build that muscle.
Would you recommend things TDD, BDD sort of style? Are you a fan of that at all?
Yeah, I would point everyone back to Kent Beck's TDD book, because it takes you through the process in a very simple way. It's like Kent just describes, here's what I'm going to do, and goes through it piece by piece. There have been lots of other books on the subject, and I think on the whole, they can lead you into the wrong level of isolation. But Kent Beck's is ideal for that. And I also like Gojko Adzic's work on specification by example is really powerful.
Right. Yeah. Anything in this graph that jumps out at you, Dan? Or I guess
I'm bringing the pessimism, I guess, today, because I'm looking at this and I'm saying 30% of the developers are using source code. What are the other 60% of people doing?
File1.old, file2.old.old.
Yeah, that's shocking. We do see a wide range of people in these surveys, and I understand, like, Game development is a little bit different, but yeah, I think that I would love to see these tools get more adopted. If people aren't using Git regularly,
Right.
man, it makes your life so much better. It's so nice. I want everything in Git. I want
Yeah, I know.
the entire legal system in Git. I want like my life in Git.
Do you think Git's too hard though for a first year, second year sort of engineer in the industry? Do you think it's hard to grok? I mean, I don't know about you, but I found it a bit kind of like all these terms were thrown at me the first time I was using it. I'm like, what is this thing, And I don't know, what do you guys think?
I think it's easy. I look, Git is really hard to do hard things. So if you've got like a bisect to Git commit, that's like, okay, I don't even know what that means. Fine. But like, I'm committing my code. I make a pull request. If that's all you know, you've covered 95% of the stuff you need to know. And every once in a while, you might have like a more complex maneuver you want to do, and
like cherry picking
look
or
it up.
something like that.
Cherry pick something, whatever. But I'm honestly like, they should teach it. I don't know what's going on in universities these days, if they're teaching Git or not, but like they should be. I mean, that should be like every project they do should be in Git. Like they should be starting by forking a repo and making their changes and doing that. I mean,
what do you guys like in terms of Git clients? I use Git Kraken. I also use command line from time to time, but I think Git Kraken is probably the best client out there for me. What do you guys use?
I'm just using the command line 95% of the time. Every once in a while, I do use the GitHub UI just on the website. Like if I'm just like reviewing a pull request or something like that, then I tend to just use the UI. Or even if I'm just making small edits, like you can hit edit, do your thing. You can even commit it to a new branch automatically. So it works pretty well. I haven't seen Git Kraken. I'm gonna check this out.
Yeah, so Git Kraken is it's not the as in get going. It's a Git Kraken as a homage to the mythical creature, but it's quite a nice experience, I find. And I know that some people are going to say command line for the win, etc. But this is not a plug for Git Kraken. I don't have any shares in Git Kraken. I just like it. I use it as a tool. So this is the one that some folks at Octopus and I use, and it's got some nice visualization. But it's a good way of visualizing branches, etc. It gives you a nice, beautiful graphs or a view and that sort of thing. So we've got some interesting insights here coming in. So this is where the wars begin. So CLI, Tortoise Git, that's a good one. Git Kraken too, cool. VS Code followed by CLI when I break something in my working copy. Yep. So this is good.
I'm similar. I tend to use whatever the IDE's got built in until it all goes wrong, and then I have to go and work out the commands again.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah, okay. What else is interesting in here? AI-assisted tools. I mean, this one's going to continue to grow. I mean, are you guys using Copilot at all or anything, some variant thereof? Yeah, Dan?
I'm not using Copilot. Honestly, I need to be. I should be. I'm a little embarrassed to admit it. But like I do use GPT regularly when I'm coding to say like, oh, write me a little thing that does this, or like help explain this piece of code if I'm having a hard time understanding it. And I found that it works really, really well. The only thing is you can't always trust it. Like sometimes it makes stuff up. We actually had an issue in the Argo community where people were taking questions in like the Slack and just throwing them into GPT and dumping the answers. And it would just make up spec. It would be like, oh, do this cool thing, and we'd be like, that's a cool spec. If we supported that would be a great answer. We don't support that. You just made it up. But I find that it makes me, it's like I'm way more productive with it. It's amazing.
Cool. Everything else seems kind of self-explanatory. The CI/CD tools, I mean, we could talk all day about these. I use GitHub Actions. I use GitHub for source control. And for issue management, for triaging issues for my open source projects, I use GitHub Actions. I don't mind YAML too much. YAML's fine. I mean, whatever. I am a fan of Dagger. I don't know if you guys have heard of Dagger at all, but it's this idea you can write your pipelines as code, and they're portable, and they're built on top of the Docker base. So the idea is that your pipelines are portable and you can move them wherever you want, etc. So I've been talking a lot about these guys for a while, but for me, I use GitHub and GitHub Actions. Call me a sellout, I don't care. But there's a lot of options there, a lot of which we support for Octopus deploys. So, for example, Azure pipelines, etc. So, just interesting to see the usage here.
I'll plug in there too, John, that
Yep.
now as part of Octopus, there is CI/CD from CodeFresh, and where we see people make use of that is you can create like a shared pipeline. So every CI kind of has their own things. I think GitHub Actions is just super accessible, super available. CodeFresh, from a CI perspective, you can create a single pipeline and have it work with like hundreds of projects, and so that can kind of cut down on maintenance stuff. So I've used most of these different CI tools. I do like that Dagger exists for local testing. GitHub Actions, the local testing experience is rough because if you really want to test locally, they use VMs to run GitHub Actions, and they're like 30 gigs. So if you actually want to run the VM that GitHub Actions is using, you got to have like a 30 gig VM. And there are some people that have made like minimized version ones with less common tools, but that's a lot. That's a lot overhead for local development.
Yeah, there's a open source tool that I've used called Act, which allows you to do local workflows. So,
if you look at the images, you can do the full. You can use Act to run full GitHub Actions, and it's like a 35 gig Docker image that you need to throw on your machine to do it.
Yeah. Hey, it's free real estate, right? As they say. So there you go. I got as much disk space as I want. Jumping back to the report itself. So looking at the key insights here. While the proportion of top performers for lead time for code change, sorry, I'll just bring this up, deployment frequency and time to restore service are down from when they began tracking in Q3 2020, they are now appear stable. So what these are referring to are 3 of the 4 DORA metrics. So these are lead time for code change, deployment frequency, and time to restore service. Steve, did you talk about this at all in your blog post, or did you?
I talked about a little bit about the impact on performance, but the interesting thing here is as an industry, we are actually seeing some drop off in performance and quite a lot of, it's called stability in performance, but actually that's a risky place to be, because the whole point of continuous improvement should be that we're getting better, year on year. So when things start flattening out, it kind of is indicative that there's a problem. So we do need to keep an eye on this. It's I think it's like an early warning at this stage. It's not like a complete crisis. But yeah, there's definite drop in performance across the whole set of respondents. Now, individual teams and organizations will be increasing their performance still, and they will be pulling ahead of the people who aren't.
I was hopeful looking at that graph, and it's the graph above this one, that it was essentially a measurement of DevOps getting wider adoption, right? So like this survey getting into, like, who's answering questions from the CD Foundation 3 years ago? It's probably early adopters. It's probably people that are more likely to be higher performers. As it gets broader and people start, becoming more familiar with all these practices, maybe you just see, hey, this wider audience is now being exposed to the stuff that they're not doing. Meanwhile, the leaders, they're just shooting away, right? They're taking off, and they're. I'd be surprised if there were very many people that were leaders like 2 years ago who aren't now. That would be a shock. Like, oh wow, like what happened? Like what went wrong where performance decreased? Because here maybe it's optimistic. I was hoping that this was essentially a measurement of how broad the survey was, how it's penetrating these less performant organizations.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting to see the inclusion of the DORA metrics here to provide insight as to how people are performing relative to that. So interesting stuff. Steve, did you have anything else you want to add to that?
Only the this relationship between adopting these techniques and tools is so strongly related to higher performance. Like we're kind of past the point of debate on it now. Like I think when Jez and Dave wrote the continuous delivery book, it was debatable, right? Because we were looking at it the same as we were looking at Extreme Programming Explained. It's like, oh, here's a way of doing software delivery. It's kind of subjective. But Slash Data are collecting all of this information. We've got Dora collecting information. It's all converging on this being the best way that we know to deliver software. So, we shouldn't be arguing about this like it's tabs versus spaces. There's like really hard data here now.
Yeah, no, if you're using these tools, if you're using good CI/CD and you've got your source code figured out and you're taking advantage of these tools, then you're going to deploy more frequently, more often, with less downtime, faster time of recovery. I mean, we've seen this trend all the way up into GitOps. As people adopt GitOps, we've seen that all those metrics just up and to the right in the positive way. There's a very strong correlation between adopting these tools and best practices and being a high performer.
There's also a correlation between performance and the number of technologies that you incorporate, isn't there, Steve?
That's right. So, and I think this is because, and I'm kind of going to hint back to Kent Beck here. I realize this is like the Kent Beck fan club today. But when he was describing XP, he was saying that the practices all need to be done because they have this effect on each other. Like if you don't do TDD, then it's hard to do refactoring, as an example. And if you don't do refactoring, it's hard to kind of keep your change, the speed of change the same throughout. It will just get slower and slower. So, and I think we've got the same thing here. If you miss out one of the tools in this tool chain, you're missing the impact it has on all the other tools. So, if you don't have test automation, your continuous integration process is just doing a build. It's not giving you any feedback on the behavior of your application, whether you've caused any problems. So it's like all of the practices fit together and support each other and have this amplifying effect. And I think that's what we see here is, if you've got a handful of the tools, you'll get some benefits from it, but the gaps will be limiting how far you can get.
That's funny because when we started CodeFresh, we were pretty laser focused on CD and like enabling continuous delivery, continuous deployment to Kubernetes. But we found that most people couldn't do it because they didn't have good CI. And so that was why we built the CI tool as part of that journey. And it is pretty amazing. Like if you don't have CI figured out, is it because you don't have source code management figured out? Because gosh, if you don't have source code management figured out, it's going to be really hard to do CI. And if you don't have CI, it's going to be really hard to do CD. And all these tools, it makes sense that they would be so complementary in this way, because it's essentially like a tech tree unlock. If you can do continuous integration, boom, you've unlocked security scanning, you've unlocked rollbacks better. You're probably doing release automation better. So you've got release artifacts that are versioned. You're getting into GitOps. Okay, now I've versioned and immutable my manifest. I can do a rollback. Suddenly, when the stress of doing a release goes down, even if the automation isn't taking any workload off of you, if the stress of a release goes down, suddenly you're releasing more often. You're like, oh yeah, it's almost zero extra work to cut that extra release. Sure, let's do it.
That's the point.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Well, I kind of do, but I like what you're saying here, which is, I know that when people look at reports like this, they're like, oh, that's academic or that's theoretical. What is it like boots on the ground? I've seen this myself with the projects I've maintained on GitHub, etc. Like when you have things automated, especially around tests and builds and all that sort of stuff, life gets a lot simpler and you start to go faster and faster and you start trusting changes going into your pipeline with tests, etc. a lot more. It's not just academic. It's not just theoretical. It is, you definitely see a performance win relative to those things.
If you want to, just to be concrete about it, we did Raziel, CEO of CodeFresh and now running cloud native business at Octopus, did a keynote with Peloton, talking about how they adopted Argo and brought in GitOps and started doing that. Their new developers, in order to get a new developer at Peloton from the first day to getting code into the platform, it took them on average 6 months. After adopting Argo and GitOps, it took them less than a week on average. So even just an onboarding task, it's like, goodness gracious. I mean, have these systems in place, have things be straightforward, have a unified way of delivering software, all that stuff. I mean, it really just impacts. It's giant.
That's so important as well, because we've all had an experience where we've started a role and they haven't even got us a laptop yet, and you're just sat. Well, this is like the same, right? If you can't actually get your first change into production for 6 months, it must feel like you're just sat on your hands. It must feel like you're not making any progress.
Yeah.
Like, and I think getting a change live in the first week brings you into that team. You're contributing. You can see your thing live. You can see the difference you're making. I think that's super important.
That even goes to another metric, which is like developer satisfaction and how they're willing to stick around. If you have good tools, they want to stay there and code. It's the number one reason that people like to stay at Google is because they have built a really good workflow for their team. And so that helps them retain engineers. And when people leave Google, they're often shocked to see the state of like, wait, you guys don't even have CI? Like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, we can get into a whole sort of debate or discussion around tools, for example. So we can talk about developer portals such as Backstage, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots and lots of stuff that you can target. I think any of these practices are good for you to institute in your organization if you can. Just as a reference here, Joanna's included it. I was looking for it earlier. If you're at all interested, you want to see the presentation by Raziel with the folks over at Peloton, you can check it out at YouTube. You can take a screenshot of this if you need the URL. Otherwise, it's in the chat. Thanks, Joanna, for that. Getting back to the report, obviously using both self-hosted and managed CI/CD platforms is associated with better delivery performance. I don't think anyone's too surprised by that. And but this one is the interesting one for me. This is the sort of high order bit for me, which is interoperability. So this is all talking about like, yeah, these systems are great. Shift left, yay, hands raised, everyone's great. But these systems don't always talk well to each other, don't they, Steve?
So I think the problem that occurs here is when you start collecting tools that do the same job, most companies go through a stage where they know they want the developers to be happy, and so they kind of make it a bit of a free choice situation, and each team picks their own version control, build server, deployment mechanism, observability tools. And what happens is it's okay for the team working on its own application. It's very hard for people to move between teams because it's so different. And if you end up working on more than one application, you're just constantly getting paper cuts because you have to find out where everything is each time. It's like, where are the builds for this service? And where's the actual like wiki page for this service that I'm trying to work on? It's like, you're not using the same wiki as everyone else. And so you cause these problems through that. And you end up then, for example, having to work out how to get all of those different CI tools to publish into a whole bunch of different CD tools. And it's just, it's like, it's in a way you're making your own life more difficult. The extreme other end of that is that someone kind of dictates exactly what you should do and tells you how to configure your IDE and doesn't let you change anything. We know that end is bad as well. Yeah. So we need to find that balance, I think, between people being able to choose to some extent, but not making it so you end up with very fragmented tool choices that make everything more difficult. I went through this with my IDE because I like to really customize my IDE color schemes and layouts. But then when you're doing pair programming, you sit down at someone else's machine and you don't recognize anything because it's so different. So just using the default out of the box IDE and kind of like sharing that with the rest of your team makes it much easier to do pair programming. And it's the same with all of the other tools as well. Like you've got someone to go to ask for help rather than everyone going, we don't even use that. We've got no idea.
Self-hosting is also a thing. Some people still do it. Despite all the cloud stuff that we have going on right now. So use of multiple self-hosted CI/CD tools can lead to longer response times to service outages. So this is again part of that DORA metric measuring that folks are doing. So code lead time for changes, deployment frequency, time to restore service. These are 3 of those 4 metrics that are often measured.
I was actually chasing down an issue this week in Argo CD where if you had a certain configuration and you were using a self-hosted Git that was not reliable, it could lead to your applications being deleted. And basically what would happen is like their source code provider, which they were self-hosting, would go offline or not be available. And so when it tried to generate the applications that were associated with it, it couldn't generate them. Again, it's a specific configuration. You have to have like 4 different things enabled to make it happen. And they're all kind of like you've set it up for yourself. But it is one of those things where I'm a big fan of self-hosting. And I think of a company like Apple. And it's like, what's the liability you carry to host Apple's code? What's the damage? What are the damages you're going to have to pay if you accidentally leak Apple's code? That's going to be a problem, right? But at the same time, there is a performance hit associated with it, right? It makes sense that like, hey, if you guys are doing, you're probably, is your team like the SRE team at GitHub? They're pretty on top of things, even with all the outages that GitHub has had over the last 2 years.
I was just gonna say,
but they have a lot of resources dedicated to it. Yeah. Is your organization going to be better at it? You may want to do it for security reasons, but you probably aren't going to do it for performance reasons.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing for the self-hosting. If you have a compelling reason to keep that thing in your walls, that's when you should self-host. If you just self-host by default, and this is what these charts show, you end up actually, the overhead of managing all of the self-hosted tools starts eating away from feature development. People are constantly having to manage the backups and working out why a backup overnight failed and dealing with all of the infrastructure. And there's a whole bunch of tasks that you come along with self-hosting. So if you start self-hosting lots of tools, especially if they're the same kind of tools, you have to imagine being the admin who has to look after a Subversion server and a Git server and a VSTS server, all these different version control types. You can't even get into a flow with it because you have to constantly be thinking, which one am I managing? So self-hosting is an option where there's a compelling reason. And that actually is the only reason you should do it.
There's 2 reasons that I've read, and I know that, DHH and others have talked about self-hosting for either cost or performance. That is the actual runtime performance. So they find that their builds are 50% faster or their costs are greatly diminished. But when I see charts like this, I think of those folks who brew their own beer, like the artisanal sort of craft beer connoisseurs and stuff. I'm like, this is like artisanal craft CI/CD, people who like to host their own stuff, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But in the face of what we have today, I think certainly there are good alternatives. There is a brief question here I just wanted to get to. Siobhan asks, can you please talk about Backstage as an IDP tool for developers? Certainly, we can briefly talk about it. So just to give you guys some context, if you want to read more about this, you can go to backstage.io. We are not affiliated with Backstage, by the way. This is from the folks over at Spotify. So this is a IDP or internal developer platform, not independent, internal developer platform. And what it does, it basically provides a portal for you to use on your development team to stand up infrastructure for your development. So the idea here is that you'll have a list of components, you'll have a catalog of those components along with what's available, you'll have charts and graphs and things like that. Basically, you can, do lots of things to kickstart your projects and maintain them and monitor them. So this is a software developer tool for tracking how your development team is doing. It also help provide them the basis of this. So so there you go. So I have a limited experience with this, but I've looked at it a number of times, and of course this was not the intent of the webinar, but we're happy to accommodate. So there you go. So great question. We had some other questions here that are rapidly coming in, so we'll just quickly answer this. So Dennis asks, have you ever calculated the cost of maintaining an on-prem versus cloud solution? I haven't. I just pull out my credit card and I'm like, I don't care. I'm not going to worry about the mental weight of this. Steve, Dan, have you guys done any calculations?
I've had to do this. In fact, I've done this multiple times. And one of the biggest problems I find in organizations is the cost of infrastructure is very calculatable, because you can see how much the cloud provider says it's going to charge, and you can price up, your own infrastructure. You can do a comparison of those. What's a lot harder to calculate is the hours you'll spend. That's really hard. And cloud obviously still needs some work. You're going to spend some hours on it. But on-prem needs lots of hours, right? You're going to be constantly maintaining things that otherwise might be automated. So that's the problem I always find, is that you can do a spreadsheet for the kind of infrastructure costs, but it's really hard to predict in advance the cost of maintaining things yourself, or indeed, like, if you don't have the skills to design cloud, it's hard to predict how much time you're spending doing that as well. So that's where it gets hard to compare.
Yeah.
Before passing it over to you, Dan, sorry, I just wanted to make an insight here, which is a good one. So Dennis then follows up, says there's a lot of regulatory stuff in Europe. Absolutely, this is a good point. Yep. Sorry, Dan.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. No, I've done calculations before on the cost to productivity, and so what I mean by that, for example, one of the costs of productivity is, if you're developing a feature, you're writing code, you're doing that for a business reason, right? You expect that's going to provide some sort of business value, and so if you look at, like, okay, how much do I think that our engineering organization is going to add in basically additional value, put a dollar amount on it. And then you take, okay, and how many issues did they work on? You can actually assign an average dollar value per issue. And then if you have that code done, it's checked in, it's ready to go, but it's not deployed. Every minute that it sits there is costing you that money. It's an opportunity cost. So just like retailers don't like to carry stuff on their shelves because it costs them money to do so, it's the exact same thing for engineering. So there's a number of ways when you really add up and think about how productivity affects your engineering organization, and that also goes into the self-hosting equation, right? Because that tells you, if I am going to self-host, if I need to, I should be spending to unlock this value here. And so I need to resource it appropriately, make sure I have enough people to make sure that this stuff is running really well, because downtime is so expensive. It's so expensive, not only in productivity, but also in like how it makes your developers more likely to want to quit and go work somewhere else. And also in how quickly you can respond to security issues and all of those things. So yeah, I've done some of that math before, and it's always kind of astonishing.
Okay. Interesting insight from John. Wait, don't all software developers brew their own beer? Yes, they do, and they also do a lot of woodworking. So all the stereotypes are true. There you go. Dennis makes a good point. Backstage is a framework for building IDPs. Yes, I've seen it used in a number of different ways. There's a catalog that you can use for it. Interestingly enough, there's actually a community plugin for Octopus Deploy, so you can expose. There's a CI/CD tab inside of Backstage where you can expose basically your deployments through Backstage, which is kind of cool. So Michael makes the point here: sustainability gets more important as well. How can you run your Kubernetes following the sun? I'm not sure what that means, but that's okay. And then Dan, of course, adding his own 2 bits. There you go. Yes, you got all your stuff on the wall.
I think he's saying that how can you run your Kubernetes to follow the sun is into follow the solar power, is into like make sure that
right. Yes.
Yeah, scheduling when stuff is running, so it's using the right kind of power, those kind of things.
Well, we'll just make the Dyson sphere and we'll be good. So, we'll be done. So anyways, sorry, that's a deep cut. So anyways, just wanted to do a time check. We're 5 minutes to the top of the hour. For folks who have just joined us, we're just discussing here the report itself. If you want to find out, more about this, you can read Steve's blog posts, which he talked a little bit about some of the high-level things that were in the report. Steve, was there anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to just mention here?
I would say probably the interesting thing about how the tools and techniques relate to the performance is they don't just improve your performance by putting you in the top category. In the charts, it shows a really high impact on pulling you out of that lowest performance category. And it's like it goes from being like 40% of people being in that category to being 19%, right? So it's like a huge difference of pulling you out of low performance. So, and that's okay too, right? That's step one, is to exit the low performance category, and then you can set your sights on the top performing categories later on. So
I thought step one was admitting you had a problem. I'm not using enough CI/CD tools. Anyways, if you want to check out the blog from Steve here, you can check it out at this URL here as well. Just to remind folks, we're been talking about the report available from the CD Foundation, which is at cd.foundation. And yes, .foundation is a TLD. It's available right there. You can check it out. I know that want to be cognizant of time. If folks have any other questions that they would like to ask, I'm just quickly going through it quickly. So Leah says, sorry, I missed the talk. We'll watch back later. Yeah, just to remind folks, we are recording this. This will be available up on our YouTube channel, and we'll make sure to post it there along with all our social media. Great talking insights. Thanks, everyone. Great. Hashtag ship it. Love it. And then Matthew asks, Steve, can we get a link to the t-shirt site?
I will go and find that now.
Yeah, let's post it. Go ahead and post it in the chat there, and hopefully Matthew can get his shirt too. Are there different colors that we should know about, or is it just all black? Or
black and
metal,
red.
Black,
it's rock and roll, man.
Red. There you go. You know what we should do for version 2 is put all the names of CI/CD tools that we use on the back with dates and stuff, kind of like a tour. So anyways. And then Leah also says step one is even knowing how long you or your team will take to do things. Yeah, of course. Estimates are very difficult. Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
No, I was saying, yeah, at least if you're not tracking what you're doing. I mean, very often we talk to people, we say, hey, you just adopted this. It seems like your team's a lot more productive. Can you quantify it? And they're like, we weren't tracking that stuff. We have no idea. They're like, we definitely feel a lot more productive though. But yeah, if you don't track what you're doing, then it's hard to know that you have a problem.
Yes. Awesome. Any final thoughts before we wrap up this webinar? Steve, Dan, anything you guys any deep insights you guys want to share?
Hey, shout out to Leah for writing that report. Good work.
Yeah. And Steve, here's the link for all the folks who want to get your hands on Steve's CI/CD shirt there. So
yeah, all the profits go to Built-in Code, so I don't make any money from it. It's
there you go,
given to the community.
Fantastic. All right, well, thanks for everyone. There's also Joanna also included. There's a link to our Octo store, which is at shop.octopus.com. So check that out. We've got some t-shirts and stickers there. Anyways, I'd like to thank Steve and Dan for joining me on today's webinar. Thank you all for your time and attention joining us here today. We really appreciate it. Don't forget, we have other webinars coming up. You can check them out at /webinars. So I'll just put this as the final banner to show. So if you go to our website, octopus.com/webinars, we have a bunch of webinars coming up there. Until next time, on behalf of Steve and Dan, thank you for joining us, and happy deployments, everyone. Take care.